Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Comprehensive Plan Steering Committee. Thank you so much for joining us on YouTube. If you're watching this, we are so excited to have members of the community interested and participating. If this is your first time joining us, please check out our page on the town website. You can find us under committees and councils. We have tons of resources. We have recordings of all of our previous meetings, minutes, educational presentations, all kinds of great stuff there. So we're excited you're here, and we hope you'll continue to stay involved. And let's see, what else did I want to tell you? We're at the beginning of a very long and involved process. So that's just important to remember. This is definitely a marathon, not a sprint. And you'll hear tonight, we're just working on still getting a lot of the introductory items ironed out and finding our way forward. So it's an exciting time. And thank you to all the committee members and to our consultant partners. We're really excited. One quick item of business before we hit 7:30, I just want to make a motion to approve the meeting minutes from, when was that? April 26th, as submitted to the committee beforehand. Can I get a second? Charlene seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. There's 3 of us. So that should do it. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay, so almost all of us are here. I'm going to pass the reins to Valerie and take it away. I know we have a full agenda, so thank you so much, and go for it.
All right, sounds good. We do have a full agenda. Why don't I get started with, well, let me just take a step back. So I sent the board an agenda earlier this week, and I also sent the board, or the committee, excuse me, a draft of the community outreach plan. So tonight, one of the things that we want to do is talk a little bit more in depth about the community outreach plan. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the timeframes with the committee, and then just in terms of answering some of the initial comments that have come in from the committee on the outreach plan. I think this is going to require a slightly larger discussion on the process and the timeframes. I think part of this is the information that we've given you and where we've gone so far is that the original request for proposal asked for a 13-month time frame. The town board wanted us to focus on a 13-month time frame. And what you saw right away is that a 13-month time frame means go, go, go. So it sounds like, based on some of the emails that came back and forth, that it might be best to maybe take a step back and refocus a little bit on the information that this committee feels comfortable with moving forward in terms of public outreach, and whether you have that all. And if not, take the time to pull together that information so that it's because really this is your process. This is your plan. This is your process, right? So we are as flexible as it needs to be in order for the committee to feel comfortable with how this process is going to unfold. Okay, so with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about, before we shift to the comprehensive plan process, community outreach process, I wanted to talk a little bit about the comprehensive plan process and the committee's role, because there was a couple questions that came up from the chair earlier this week in terms of, does the committee actually make decisions versus the town board? And so I just wanted to take 2 minutes to talk a little bit about that. And then if this committee feels that they need to get more input from the town board, we can do that as well over the next month or so. But town law basically has, 2 different tracks. Either the town board can retain sole decision-making on the entire process, right? And so basically the town board runs through the decisions on all aspects of the comprehensive plan, community outreach, and then ultimately ends up doing the public hearings and adopting. The other tracks can be the town board can develop a comprehensive plan committee that makes decisions about the comprehensive plan process, makes decisions about the research, makes some decisions about the goals and recommendations, and then ultimately turns that overall recommendation of an overall comprehensive plan, overall zoning amendments, turns that over to the town board, and then the town board ultimately will hold the public hearings and adopt the particular comprehensive plan. So the assumption from us is that that's the track that the town board has decided to move forward with in terms of your role through this process, because they developed a comprehensive plan steering committee. Go ahead, Charlene.
I just take, we're not a decision making. Yes, we make decisions as to some things, but remember, we also have 2 town board liaisons on it. So ultimately, it's really not our decision, and we're not a decision-making board. I mean, I don't think whether one track or another is taken. Ultimately, the decision of whether to adopt that plan is solely within the town's.
Absolutely, but we're going to be looking at, for example, base maps tonight, right? And how to approach the hamlet areas. And so the question then comes into play is that, does this committee have the authority to make those decisions that are going to get incorporated into the comprehensive plan and the comprehensive plan process, including the community engagement process? Or does this committee feel that based upon the, what was your charge, that we need to bring in the town board more on these types of decisions? And I think that will also ultimately affect how we proceed with the review of all documents, all draft documents, as well as, moving through the process itself.
That's pretty much the process with a liaison on our committee and
Okay.
attending meetings. Then it's their responsibility, I think, to keep the town board apprised. And obviously, when you meet with the town board and you begin your process with them,
Right.
if we say A and they say B, obviously a B holds and not the A, because they are the ultimate deciders. I mean, I'm not saying that we'd have no decision making. I mean, but these are operational, really not of a substantial aspect. It's an operational, how are we going to do the process? They're process decisions. And I'm sorry to interrupt you and take time on this, but I think that's really important for us to clarify at this point. If anybody
Yes.
thinks otherwise,
So it sounds like then, I think moving forward, we definitely want to make sure that the 2 town board liaisons are part of every meeting. And we need to get their, make sure that we get their buy-in and also agreement with how we move through some of these different elements in the comprehensive plan process.
I don't think they have to be present at every meeting, because we have a YouTube, and then Katie does a wonderful job of getting everybody up to date.
Okay.
I'm just saying that as liaisons, they do have the responsibilities, not that they have to be with us every minute. I'm sure they're not into watching our every move. But as long as their liaisons there and Katie has access to them, which I know she does, then we can sort of work as a committee and do what we need to do, and they will be apprised of it, but not as the ultimate decision makers.
Okay.
I think the framework that we've been using to think about things is reflected in how we put the RFP together. So we as the committee drafted it and spent a long time editing it until it was in a really good place. And then we shared it with the town board and the planning board and the zoning board and the architectural review board and solicited their input. And then we made edits and adjustments. And then we kicked it to the town board and said, this is final. Everybody's input is here. Please give us your approval that we can issue this publicly. Obviously, not everything is going to be as serious a decision as issuing an RFP, but sort of that framework, like we're the facilitators. We gather up inputs from related parties, but we start the process, we gather input, and then we have the final that we put out for stakeholder input, for stakeholder approval.
Okay, so then that's what I think we should continue proceeding under. And so we will look to you to, when we're like, for example, the draft community outreach plan. Once we have the draft community outreach plan in a form that this committee feels comfortable with, then I'll leave it up to you to decide which other boards need to review, comment, and then we can, clearly make any sort of adjustments then at that point, and then we'll consider those to be at that point to be final and to be issued for the public review or ultimately, public implementation.
That sounds good to everybody.
Okay.
Okay,
Great.
cool.
All right, so one of the first things that we want to talk about tonight is the base map. So I'm just going to share my screen. Let me just pull up my maps for a second. Okay. So what we're looking to do as part of, can everyone see the map on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So what we're looking to do as part of the comprehensive plan, we're going to be developing a number of maps that all hold different, that provide you information on various environmental topic areas based upon the outline that was reviewed by this committee last month. And one of the things that we're focusing on is developing like what we call base map, which sort of identifies, the primary areas we're going to want the reader to focus on, as well as some of the basic elements that we're going to consider that are important in terms of identifying like location on a map, or also identifying, basic information for the reader to be able to situate like the environmental topic areas that we're going to be reviewing throughout the comprehensive plan. So we have identified on this particular map, this is the base map that we're looking to move forward with. And the thought is we clearly have the full town. We have each one of the hamlet areas identified on the map in the locations that we believe are, relative locations of where those hamlet areas are centered. And the thought process with this, and I'm going to show you another example, is that as we go through and identify very specific areas that where like there's particular areas that have a lot of information or information that's very unique, we will have those identified in call out boxes depending upon the environmental topic area that we're reviewing. So for example, this is right now, it's a very draft land use map, but what we see here is that like Cross River, Golden's Bridge, as well as, some of these other areas near the Vista Hamlet area have a number of different land uses, and we're highlighting those particular ones because those have risen to the top in terms of information that we think readers are going to need to get a little bit more details on. And then most likely those will be information that we detail a little bit more in the narrative as well. So the thought was to have one general map, and then as we go through each environmental topic area, have call outs depending upon what the data is showing us in the different environmental topic areas. What you will find is that, for example, and let me just show you another one. So what you'll find is that sometimes we'll get to a topic area that is just all you need to do is show the map itself, because we're really just going to be talking in general terms about, and this is like steep slopes, where are your steep slopes located throughout the town.
Valerie, do you have any indication where the watershed areas are?
We do have maps on those, and those will be separate maps under the environmental topic areas.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So I just wanted to make sure before we continue proceeding that the committee is comfortable with this concept of having, you know, basically this is the base map we'll be using, and then we'll be doing call out boxes depending upon the information that's necessary to highlight.
The
So
concept, oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I think I have two questions. We can agree on as a committee on whether we're comfortable with the concept, but then do you need, is this information like fixed and factual, or do you need input from people on the ground here to actually confirm that the information in the map is accurate?
Right. So the next step is once we get, that's why we want to have just a little bit of a green light on this concept, because then what we're going to be doing is now starting to really populate the maps. And we'll be sending you the maps to start reviewing once we have those complete. So in terms of, you know, and I'm going to send this base map out because one of the things we want to have you highlight right away is while we believe we caught like all the major lakes within the town, if for some reason we're missing a lake or two, we'd like that to be identified. And we're not talking about every, because I know you have a lot of lakes, but what we're really looking at is your larger lake communities, which we think we've identified most of them. But if for some reason we're missing any, we'd like you to note that. We'd also like you to note that if you have concerns with where we're highlighting the overall hamlet areas, again, we'd like you to also identify that as well. And so I'll send that to the committee for your review over the next couple of weeks, just to identify any particular changes that you feel need to be made to this base map. And again, we are going to be getting into a lot of the environmental topic areas. So we're not necessarily looking for, like just as like Charlene noted, like where are the watersheds, that will be a separate map. But what we're looking for is any inaccuracies on this particular map. Like, so, you know, is a particular road that's labeled wrong? You know, do we need to change that? Those are the things that we're going to look for from you.
Will you work with the building department and the consultants from the planning board? Because they would know all that. They would know a lot too.
So I think what we're looking for the committee to do, and this is where your role will be, is that, you know, I'll send you the map. If you feel that the building department or planning board needs to look at the map, you know, you're more than welcome to send it over to them. And then we'll look for them to, you know, refer it back to you with any comments, and we'll probably provide you a deadline so that we can make sure that we are able to move forward with our work as well.
So you won't work with them directly?
Well, we are going to be reaching out to all the different department heads, and we'll be reaching out, we'll be talking to the planning board about their goals and concerns, and we'll be meeting with them periodically throughout the process. But if there is, I mean, if you're looking for, I think we're looking for the committee to review the maps. If you feel that you need to have the planning board review them, then that's fine too. We can always then, that becomes one of the planning board meetings that we have with the planning board. And that's something we'll need to get some feedback from this committee. Typically comprehensive plan committees will review the maps themselves. And only if the town or community feels that there's necessary to bring in a particular department head for a particular map, they'll bring those people in at that time.
Okay, maybe my question is what's the source of these maps? And
this is
how old
Westchester County. They're all Westchester County GIS.
They're all Westchester up to date.
Yes, yes.
So when you referred to watersheds, though, this is larger bodies. This doesn't include a map of wetlands.
No, we will have a map on that as well. We'll have a map of wetlands for both New York State DEC as well as the federal wetlands that are inventoried currently as part of available GIS data.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that on my action item grid, for actions that need to happen between now and the next meeting, I need to add a line item, coordinate base map reviews, and I can take that on but I will need to solicit after this meeting via email. We'll have to put our heads together and just say, like, these people from the town and from boards definitely need to review. And then I'll send out a big email to everybody and say, did I miss anybody? Does anybody else want to have a say here? And this is the deadline that we need your feedback. Does that sound right to everybody?
That sounds right. Now, just keep in mind, the only map we're looking for people to review is this map. To start
Okay.
off with.
Just-
Then we will be coming in with a lot of other maps for you to start reviewing, starting over the next few months.
Okay. So
So
you'll
this is not a map, like, these are just the general areas of the hamlets, not a closer designation of the hamlets.
So that's the next thing we're going to talk about. So this is just a general town of Lewisboro map. That's correct. Now,
is everybody comfortable with the concept before we move on? Okay.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm gonna stop. Well, let me just pull up. All right, so let me close out a couple of these maps so my computer doesn't freeze. All right, so one of the things that we want to talk about are the hamlet areas. So at the last meeting, let me pull up, I have 2 more maps to show. Okay, so at the last meeting, we talked about trying to, if possible, there are going to be certain data points that this committee was interested in identifying as part of the hamlet areas. And we also said that there are particular environmental topic areas that we also agreed that would be helpful and useful to have as part of the, breakdown on the hamlet areas. So as this committee knows, there are no specific or defined boundaries of the hamlet areas. And so a couple of things that were discussed at the last meeting was to look at how would we cull this information. And so you have a couple different options. And this is one of the things that we wanted to talk a little bit about to the committee about. The first option is actually defining the boundary areas, right? We basically go through street by street and say, this is the boundary of, for example, South Salem. We'll define it. Then we can take that in GIS and then clip all the data around that particular boundary area. It seems like that there are a number of hamlets that don't really have a defined boundary area. And it's more of an identity that maybe residents in that area feel that they're part of a particular hamlet, or some of it is there are a little bit of defined boundaries, but not very specific defined boundaries based upon history of the town. So
Question.
another option.
Oh, go on. You're probably going to answer
Okay.
my question.
So another option is taking a look at zip codes, as well as what I'm going to call block groups. These are, and let me just pull up the zip codes. So another way of being able to potentially cull data from the GIS is to basically clip, what we're calling clip, basically pull data that falls within, for example, this particular zip code. The difficulty that we found when we mapped the zip codes, because there was some thought that maybe the zip codes align a little bit with the hamlet areas. And as you can see, they don't necessarily align with the hamlet areas. So there is a little concern with whether that would be really an effective way of dealing with the hamlet areas. The third option we looked into was what we call the census block groups, which are basically the census data basically provides census on data on the townwide. Then they go by what they call census tracts, which is like a little bit of a smaller grouping. And then the smallest grouping is your block groups. But again, based upon what we're seeing in the census data, we have a little concern with whether the actual block groups identify the hamlet areas as appropriately as we think they probably should in terms of where we think their geographic location is. So the last option that we wanted to kind of put forth for the board to consider deals a little bit with what we were just talking about with the mapping. And so, for example, as we go through the mapping, where we feel that there's something interesting taking place in some of the hamlet areas, we can kind of highlight those and pull that information out visually and then describe it in the narrative. but it wouldn't necessarily have very concrete data associated with it that you would in terms of if you were able to, let's say, for example, go with the census block groups where you can actually basically carve out the data from the GIS information. So where in GIS, we can basically tell them, like, let's say, for example, population, we can actually have it clip the data, the population data specifically to that boundary area. We won't be able to do that if we focus on just generalities of what we're seeing within the mapping. However, we do think that this might be a little bit, we think that this might be a little bit more accurate in terms of boundary areas than some of the other options before this board.
Valerie, I have two questions. One
Sure.
is that it has always been my understanding that hamlets were areas that were not municipalities, obviously, but were commercial, small commercial hubs. And secondly, have you ever worked with self-identified hamlets, which are not, you know, not in the traditional sense hamlet?
Yes, and we worked in the town of Carmel, and some of them were basically, you know, some of them were census designated places, which, you know, the census actually identified. And you have one, which is Golden's Bridge, but the rest are not census designated places. There are some hamlets where while there's no specific geographic boundary, we do highlight the data based upon what we're seeing in the maps and also what we're seeing based in terms of like on the ground when we're within that particular hamlet area. So that's what we were thinking the general approach would be for these hamlets, because you really only have one census designated place and the rest of them are not identified in the census, you know, data. So we were thinking of maybe taking a step back and treating all the hamlets uniformly and focusing on what we see within the data generally.
That would be my.
So for example, like Walkabuck, I know it tends to be more residential, right? Where you're going to definitely see in Cross River and Golden's Bridge, there's going to definitely be more commercial. So some of like, so for example, with the land uses, you know, the Walkabuck area is going to have primarily single family uses, right? So that one wouldn't be one that we would specifically highlight on this map, but yet we would talk about it in terms of in the narrative by looking at the map and seeing that, yes, it's generally a single family, you know, zoning and land use. However, in terms of like Cross River or, you know, for example, like some of Lewisboro, we're going to be able to identify and say like, look, there seems to be a lot of like community services that are located within the hamlet of Lewisboro, or we'll be able to identify in terms of Cross River, some of the commercial aspects that we're seeing there. And so that's
Vista and South Salem also have commercial aspects.
Yes. Right. And you're going to see this a little bit with like the historic areas, right? So some of the hamlets are really going to have a lot of historic areas. Of course, now Walkabuck has its historic district. So that one would be one that we probably would highlight, you know, on a map, and then also in the narrative that like now that has a prominent role within the community in terms of historic. So does this sound like a reasonable approach to deal with the hamlet areas in this, like because of the situation where we don't really have very specific defined boundaries?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Valerie. Is this just for like the mapping purposes and presentation, or how the like demographic information is analyzed, or both?
Both. Because the demographic data we can only pull if we have a defined boundary area, and it's not defined in the census data. So what we would have to do is actually basically we cull that data then from what we're calling the GIS data. And even though this is pretty maps, behind GIS, behind these pretty maps is like tables of data. And so we can pull that information based upon actually and let me just pull up this, it's because it's easier to visualize. If we said to the GIS data, like, we want only the data associated with this boundary area. And JT, if I'm
Yeah, I can talk a little about this. The software that we use, if you wanted to define specific boundaries for each hamlet and then collect population, demographics, median income for each hamlet, because you want to see the differences between Golden's Bridge and Vista. We can do that, but you'd have to draw a specific polygon, either following roads, or you could follow water. You could make any boundary you like, really, and then we can ask the map to calculate how many people live in that artificial boundary that we've created. But in order to do that, we'd have to make decisions and essentially decide, where does Golden's Bridge end and where does Cross River begin, and draw a line, for better or worse, and then we could collect information for each polygon. Or we could, I suppose you could also make the polygon smaller around each hamlet, and then have another area which was not in a hamlet, everything that's left over. There would be maybe some leftover land that's not associated with any hamlet. You could do it that way too. So
John, I have a
really all
question.
depends on whether you want to go through the exercise of defining specifically where each hamlet starts and ends.
John, I have a question, and I'll give you like a specific, like, let's look at like Lewisboro and Vista, like the pink and the orange.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And they look to me like they're like geographically about the same size, like they're
Right.
together. And if we were to say, okay, Lewisboro is kind of the top half of the orange and the top half of the pink, and Vista is the bottom half of both.
Yeah.
Would the geographic information system that you're using, if we cut those orange and pink like triangles in half, basically,
Mm-hmm.
would it say, I'm going to look at the demographics of the pink triangle and I'm going to give half of it to Lewisboro and half of it to Vista? And would it do the same thing for the pink and the orange, or does it have actual like data by like household on the map?
Well, it would go into the census blocks. The pink area is a block group, and each block is an actual block where you walk down one street, keep making a left turn until you come to the point in a circle. And that's a block. So there's probably 40 or 50 blocks in the pink and 40 or 50 blocks in the salmon. And the machine would look at how many houses are in each block and how many people are in each block and add them up together. And instead of the census uses these figures that are on this picture, but we would be using new polygons to suck out the block data and sum it together to get other numbers.
I think we're getting, before we keep getting into the weeds, the question that I think we're all wondering, why we need to hear from you. Why does this matter? Like, what do we need to see in the plan to make recommendations for the community? Like, is how we classify this and count households, like, is that going to impact important decisions? Or
it might. It really depends on what you're looking to do. If you think that one area is growing in population and needs more housing, and another area is stable and hasn't changed in 30 years, you might recommend new zoning in a growing area and leaving the zoning alone in a not growing area. And then you'd want to have some numbers on that. And if, let's say, people in Golden's Bridge were resistant to the idea of some zoning to allow higher density housing, then you'd have data that said, well, folks, look at this. In the last 30 years, this area has tripled in population and the median age is going down. There's more children. We need to, if, there's more housing that's needed in this area, that has, perhaps rental housing that's not available now. If you knew that in that area, a certain thing was happening, a certain type of demographic was developing that needed a different zoning treatment. If really that isn't where you're going, and I think you all living and being on this committee in Lewisboro, you've got a sense of and I would assume you maybe have some preconceived ideas of where you would be going with recommendations in the plan, even now, as we're just starting.
Exactly what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah,
Okay.
and actually, we don't have the base information. At least I don't have the base information to decide. Like, I don't know where the commercial areas really are zoned, and how much commercial is there. And Valerie made a good point. In Lewisboro, there is like the town center, and that's different. But it's sort of, I don't have enough information to say this is what I want to do, and I
Right.
don't believe there's enough information to ask the public what they want to do.
So
yeah.
Go ahead, Charlene.
It's the point that I think we need more information from you that you've gathered from the GIS and the census stuff and the zoning map.
Right. So I think because of the situation that we have with the boundaries, I would recommend that maybe we allow for us to map as much information as possible in terms of even just visually, right? Since, so we can probably pull some additional, like maybe some population data, some other additional census data, and really identify where we see certain, I'm going to say, anomalies or some interesting data that seems to be rising up based upon what we're seeing in the actual maps. And then from there, we can talk a little bit more about in the narrative about what we're seeing and what might be the reasons for what we're seeing in terms of like those particular hamlet areas. Because what I think we're going to find, and I've seen a little bit of the maps, you're going to find that some hamlet areas are more unique to other environmental conditions than other hamlet areas. And so maybe the focus on housing might not necessarily be in, and again, we haven't, this is just, these are just examples we're using, but like maybe the focus on like some additional density in housing might not be in the Walkabuck, but could be in the Cross River area, because maybe it's going to be more supported by certain commercial aspects. So those
it's the trends
types of things
too.
that we'll be able to divide it. Exactly. So I think in terms of some of the very detailed trends, that's where it becomes a little bit difficult because we don't have those defined boundary areas. However, if we try to map as much as we can visually, you'll see some of those trends visually. You just might not have, it might not be down to 755 people, but you might be able to say, oh, look, it's more concentrated here, and the legend itself is giving you a little bit wider of a range.
And
that's
also how it fits into the zoning, the present zoning.
Exactly.
I mean, it sounds like that's a good place to start, and then we will expect from you and your team that if you're seeing areas where having a defined boundary and getting distinct data would be helpful and would help us make better decisions and better recommendations, then we can quickly rally the town around deciding boundaries. I mean, we can certainly do that if we have to.
Okay. Yeah. And like I said, I think, based on, we did like a few initial maps, because I think what you're going to find on a number of the maps, you're going to see things like, like what I was saying, for example, like the steep slopes. There's going to be a lot of maps that just show you your wetland areas, your steep slope areas. You're not going to need to have exactly how much of the land is specifically steep slopes, right? It might just be, we might do a call out in a particular area, but there's not, in terms of making decisions, visually, we can say, you know what, in this particular area, let's say, for example, we find that there's a lot of sensitive environmental resources. You have a lot of these steep slopes. Oh, but you don't have a steep slopes law. That might be something that the town might want to consider adopting, right? And that's how we would make that connection where, for example, if your whole entire town looked like this, no steep slopes, that's not something that's going to rise to the top of saying, do you have steep slopes regulations in your zoning? Okay. So that's where we'll start with. And then as we go through, and I think I can't emphasize enough that there really is this process, this back and forth process that's going to take place as we start looking at the data and as we start investigating the data and as we start pulling together the narratives. And so, this is not like final decisions, but we just needed a sort of a path in which to start pulling the data and pulling the maps for this committee for their review. Okay. Any other questions on that?
I summed it up as your team will finish the Hamlet map, identify anomalies, trends, and interesting data, alert the committee if the town needs to identify boundaries in order to gather better data for future decision making.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Sounds perfect.
Sounds
Yes.
good. Okay.
Yes. And it's a lot, there's a lot. I promise we're gonna start getting into the fun stuff. This is more like the housekeeping, the data heavy information right now. And soon you're gonna see that it's a lot easier once we start developing these maps and having these conversations. We'll be providing you tables. So there's a lot of things that you'll be getting and a lot of data you'll be getting. And that's why we kind of want to have these conversations now, is how do we start really pulling this stuff for this committee. Okay, so let's talk about the community engagement plan, because this is another that's going to be a little bit, we're going to dive a little bit more into the details. So why don't I would like to share, I'm going to share again, if that's all right with everybody, the community engagement plan. And I have, Katie, I have your comments. And so I thought it'd be good to kind of go through your comments, because I think some of them aligned with like the comments from the planning board. And I think they'll also help with answering questions from this committee in general. Okay. All right, so this is a draft document, so it's just primarily here for the framework of the, for discussion, and I'll make sure that it's clear as I start sending out information exactly what it is that what kind of feedback I'm looking for from the committee, and whether I'm considering something a very draft document for discussion purposes versus something that I think is more final draft and ready to roll out to whatever needs final blessings or approvals in terms of the document. So typically a community engagement plan, and I just want to touch base on that, is really just an overarching plan. It's not absolutely set in concrete, because I think you're going to find as you go through the process, things are going to shift, issues are going to rise, there's going to be something that you're going to want adjusted, and that's absolutely fine. This is really meant just to be like kind of a framework for what it is that your overall intent is going to be, kind of where we're going to go with some of the meetings, general schedules, that I can guarantee you that things will shift, like almost guaranteed that things will shift because of just the interactions with the public, the interactions with the process, and the things that will come up throughout the overall comprehensive plan process. So one of the first things that came up, and that's why we had this initial discussion at the beginning, is we had some information in here that the role of the CP, the Comprehensive Plan Steering Committee, is to act as the primary decision-making body for the comprehensive plan process. And so that's why I wanted to, I think there was some concern with the language of like the decision-making body. And really, we're talking about the comprehensive plan process, not necessarily the comprehensive plan. But what I'll do is I will reword that a little bit so that it's not so much an emphasis on decision-making, but you're really going to be guiding the comprehensive plan process and the information that's going to be going and being incorporated into the comprehensive plan, as well as some of the outcomes of the document itself. And I think that should take care of your concerns, Katie, in terms of the guidance that you received from the town attorney as to the comprehensive plan committee's role? In terms of like, go ahead.
I think we covered it earlier in the meeting.
Okay. All right, so the next thing I wanted to just kind of highlight this section here, I'm going to identify again our overall meetings and kind of the general agenda items of the meetings. Now, one of the things that will shift, and this is when we'll get into a little bit more of the community outreach process, is that if for some reason right now everything in this document is based on a 13-month process. So this is where we're going to start discussing about making some changes. And when we make, if the committee decides to make those changes, I'll reflect those in the overall comprehensive plan committee meeting agenda. But in terms of the overall meetings, I still think we'll be able to hold meetings like at least, once a month. There might be times that if we decide we need to, like, for example, if there's like the survey that we're going to be talking about a little bit later on for accessibility, if it takes a couple months to do that, not that we're going to disappear, but we might say instead of meeting every month, let's meet every other month, because there's other work that's being taken place and it's going to take a little bit of time to undertake that work. So this schedule here will get adjusted depending upon ultimately some of the other decisions that this committee ends up making. This section here really focuses on outreach initiatives. And I know, Katie, you mentioned that it was missing the town board meetings, planning board meetings, ZBA meetings in general. And I will absolutely add them. They're part of the schedule. We're definitely going to be undertaking them. A lot of times this particular document really focuses on community outreach, where the town board meetings and the town committee meetings are really focused, or town board meetings are really focused on, that's municipal input as opposed to community input. But if we want it all included in the same document, I'll just add those additional meetings in, identifying that when those will take place throughout the process.
Maybe you could put in a narrative that you will be meeting with,
Yes.
administration, et cetera, and not naming, every board and when you're going to meet with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a narrative, if that's okay with Katie, a narrative would be sufficient to address it. What do you think?
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, committee members, but just based on conversations we've had in the past, like the more we can make things simple, but also clear and transparent. Like if we have this document and it shows all our community engagement plans, it might as well also show our plans for municipal engagement, because everything really is interconnected. And it's silly for somebody to have to go to one document to see how the town board's going to be involved and another document for the committee. If we can mash it all together, I think that might be more efficient. But a narrative would be okay as long as it's clear the extent to which and how many times you're going to be meeting.
Yeah, that's what I meant. I mean, it's just a clear narrative.
Yeah,
absolutely. We can do that. That's not a problem.
We don't want any board members of any board feeling left out or confused about how they fit into the process.
Because those meetings are not public too. Also, so I think if a narrative explains that you'd be meeting with administration, blah, 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 individually, as groups, because it's not a public meeting when you meet with the town board or when you meet with the zoning board, et cetera.
Right.
Yeah, as long as everybody knows you're going to meet with them each several times and they're going to have their real involvement.
Great. All right, so this is what, Katie mentioned a couple things about, like, this is missing some virtual sessions, pop-up events, and subcommittees in terms of outreach. So this framework here is the framework in which right now we submitted for our proposal and that we have as part of like our contract. That can be flexible and we can shift things. In terms of right now we have, we're definitely going to do town committee interviews, and that's all those 17 committees. So we'll be meeting with all of them. And those are more outreach because those really make up, as much as your planning boards and zoning boards make up members of your community, those are also, those town committees are not necessarily your land use boards, and they tend to have a lot more of a framework in which they, in which they're supposed to operate under. For example, like the zoning board has very specific, regulations and guidelines in which they have to follow. Where, your environmental advisory committees or some of your other like housing committees, they're much more flexible in terms of, what their overall, objectives are, because they're meant to basically be flexible in terms of changing when your community's environment changes and when other issues rise. So we identify those as part of like the community outreach because of that. We have the online survey, we have the one townwide public workshop, and that's going to be really focused on like sort of existing conditions. And then we also have one townwide public workshop and 6 hamlet workshops focused on visioning goals and objectives. And then one townwide public workshop focused on zoning amendments. And then one public hearing to solicit public comment on the draft plan and zoning amendments. So the public hearing is required. So, but really for the general development of the comprehensive plan and the zoning, a lot of it's going to be focused on the different workshops itself. So we can talk as we go through this in terms of the 6 hamlet workshops, whether the committee feels that 6 in-person hamlet workshops are the best process, or whether we want to have 6 like sort of scaled back hamlet workshops and do 6 online sort of, workshops, or try to develop some sort of online like platform in which to also engage with people in the hamlet areas, or whether you want to shift your focus and have the hamlets as like online meetings and then have the townwide meeting as like an in-person meeting. So there's a number of different options, and this is where we look to you as the committee to sort of identify what you think would work within your community based upon your current public participation in public meetings. And that even says with the pop-up events, I sort of looked at some of your events throughout the year, and you have a number of events that occur that instead of, we can also identify some other pop-up events, but this might be a way of really being able to garner other people from the public who might not necessarily attend a public meeting because maybe they have children, maybe they're busy, but maybe we can grab them at the trunk or treat. You know what I mean? Like, cars in the parks, even some of the Juneteenth Freedom, Day celebration. Are these potential, events that we think that we might be able to, capture some new members from the community that have not yet participated in the comprehensive plan process?
Also, just as a general rule, we found that often going to an established event that's going to have hundreds of people anyway, it's much easier to get people to notice and come to a table to learn about the comprehensive plan than if you have a standalone pop-up event that's the only thing that's happening, and the only reason to go to that school or whatever is to hear about the plan. It's not nearly as popular as if you set up shop at an established event that already has a built-in audience.
Yeah, one event you might want to add is, I think now that Lewisboro actually has new residents, they run, Parks and Rec runs a little program for new residents each year.
Okay.
I think it's probably already happened for this year, but
I think it's in June.
I think it's in June, but
Well,
Just
and
thinking
that's-
this through, I mean, there's so many topics to cover, and this plan hasn't been updated in such a long time. I kind of feel like one townwide meeting isn't enough. I'm wondering if we should have like 6 townwide meetings, and you break out into hamlet like subgroups, and maybe one meeting is talking about like parks and open spaces, and another meeting is talking about transportation and bicycle and pedestrian, and maybe have like hamlet breakout sessions, but do like multiple townwide groups, and that way also if we have low turnout, you could always group like Vista and Lewisboro together, or you could group, you could have group some of those hamlets together. But I'm just thinking like there's just so much material to cover that it just seems like 1 or 2 townwide workshops aren't enough. And I do think that there are very engaged residents in a lot of the hamlets where you will have people showing up to multiple meetings if we had the meetings with breakout sessions into hamlets. And I'm wondering if that's something that's like, I know in person you could probably do it, and I'm thinking like even if it was on Zoom, you could break out into separate rooms as well. I'm just wondering if that's something that you've done in other places, and what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. I've actually, one of the comprehensive plans that I worked on was like about 10 years ago. We focused on topic areas as opposed to looking at existing conditions and then goals and, goals and recommendations. We did topic workshops and then got feedback off of those individual topic workshops. That is effective in terms of people came to the topics that they were most interested in. The only drawback sometimes in that is that, you might want to also get people's feedback who might be very focused on the environment to see what they actually think about commercial development, right? Because they might actually have something to really weigh in from an environmental perspective on commercial development, but they don't realize that if they're coming to only an event focused on, let's say, for example, your natural resources. That being said, there were definitely people that that went to every one of those different workshops. So that is an option if this committee wants to consider that. We could rearrange, those various workshops to focus on environmental topics, but those environmental topics would need to include your existing conditions and then some potential goals and recommendations, and get feedback kind of like on everything in one workshop.
Let's pause that for a second. I think if we keep going down in the document where you talk about the actual content of each meeting, that we'll be able to hone in a little bit more.
Sure. Okay. So these I'm gonna just move on from Katie.
Yeah, we can come back to those at the end.
Yeah, well, I think that's really deals with like responsibility, and we can talk about that at the end. Here's where all the town committee interviews. So we identify all the different committees that we're gonna do review, as well as like kind of like the overall general categories of which those committees represent. And so we'll be tailoring the questions associated with these kind of topic areas with the committees, as opposed to just having very general questions, because we think it'll be more helpful to us and also provide you some additional information if it's focused. The online survey, why don't I get back?
When you have the specifics like veterans and LGBTQ, what about like a Hispanic community? Do we have, have we dealt with that?
There are, in a lot of communities that we have high Hispanic populations, typically there are certain groups that will automatically get identified to reach out to those. And
Right.
Some of it's religious organizations, some of it's actual like community organizations. If this committee has very specific knowledge of, particular organizations or particular like religious organizations that we should target, we can identify those and invite them to this as well.
let's come back to that, because like that really, we need to have a focused conversation about stakeholders, how we identify hard to reach groups, how we identify accessibility needs. Like that's a whole important big topic. If you,
Yes.
we want to stick on let's stick on the topic of the meeting content first and then come back to that next.
Yeah, absolutely. But if for some reason there is an organization, like a number, like we represent certain communities that it's a very common place that, oh, this organization needs to be part of that. Like, you know, a particular housing organization is very prominent in that community. We can add them into this grouping in terms of just reaching out to them as part of that.
To be clear, these are the existing town committees.
Yes.
That's all they are. That's where we got
Okay.
them from.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to skip over the online survey for right now, because let's get to the public workshops. All right. So the workshop format, and this is what we find to be most effective in, you know, over the years, is kind of keeping this what we call it a workshop, you know, and we can talk about whether we actually have like a little bit of a presentation ahead of time and then open it up for workstations, or we just automatically just have a workstation as part of the presentation material that we would normally present as a workstation itself. But what we usually like to do is kind of keep an open house format. So if somebody cannot come for the first 15 minutes of a presentation, they're not completely lost for the evening. That for some reason, you know, somebody is like, we have the workshop open from like, let's just say, you know, 4 to 8, and people can come at 5, people can come at 6, they can come whenever is, you know, best for them to appear, and they can move throughout the room and provide their feedback at their own timetable and their own schedule. We find that sometimes that ends up drawing more people in, as opposed to somebody feeling like they have to commit like 2 full hours, or it's only specific times. So that's sort of the thought process in terms of how we would have this, each one of the workshops. But in terms of, you know, the format itself and the topic areas, the first public workshop was really going to be focused on, you know, what we're calling the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for various environmental topic areas. So this is a way of, like, let's say, for example, we'll have a map of, like, a lot of it's going to be your maps that you saw, the beginning of the maps you saw tonight. Those maps will be identified and blown up on, you know, large poster boards, and where people can identify, like, let's say, for example, we have one on open space and natural resources. People can identify, like, what are the open spaces that they really find that are, like, most important to them, or what open spaces do they find that, you know, need you know, additional resources, or where the particular areas that they're concerned with that, you know, potentially could be developed and needs to be looked at in terms of potential conservation. So that's where these issues of, like, what do you find most, you know, positive, you know, in terms of what are the concerns, your weaknesses, opportunities, you know, the communities will identify, like, things be important in terms of, you know, potential recommendations, and then also threats in terms of, like I was saying before, what are things that they might feel that if something continues going down the path it is, that, you know, that particular resource is going to be concerned or threatened with. And so that's part of the dialogue that we would ask on the various environmental topic areas. So, and the environmental topic areas would probably be focused, and I just identified these based off of the outline, but a lot of, you know, the initial vision for the overall comprehensive plan based upon, you know, we'll start with a framework again based upon this committee, and then receive feedback from the community on that. But open space and natural resources nicely come together on, you know, maps, sustainability, climate change, and this will include your utilities as well as community facilities, because all of them at this point really intertwine with each other. Complete streets and transportation, historical resources and community character, and then housing.
I would try to add something in there about technology, because it's becoming the internet, access, all that is becoming more and more important. I think that's would be one.
Yes, and that will end up under the utilities and in terms of sustainability, because we all found out in the last pandemic that when we didn't have the broadband networks, you know, you had a lot of communities that were struggling.
Am I reading this correctly that the goal of the first workshop is to get input from people on topics, but ultimately to iron out a vision statement? Is the vision statement like the big takeaway from the first workshop?
It's both. They're all equal, because it's really important to identify from the community what their concerns are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what are things that they value, because that's going to then get incorporated into some of the goals and recommendations. But the vision itself is also very important too. So there's going to be, that's going to have like a table of it on its own. And then we will also have the individual topic areas getting feedback on that. Then that will all get incorporated, right? So let's say, for example, everyone thinks the vision should be X, but what we're seeing in the feedback is that we also need to bring in these other elements. We can do that as part of the next process and iterative of the vision itself.
Mm-hmm. So that's workshop number 2, is to
Right.
drill down on the proposed vision statement and the areas of strengths and weaknesses.
Yes, yes. So that's going to focus on, you know, we're going to dive deeper into like the environmental topic areas in terms of like recommendations. And then that's when we're going to start focusing on some of your opportunity areas. So looking at areas within the town that could potentially have very specific focus in the comprehensive plan, depending upon, again, this is community feedback. We might find that that's not where the community wants us to go, and that's fine too. But this is right now, this is what we're thinking that would be a nice way of bringing the opportunity sites into the overall discussion. Mm-hmm. And then we'll also focus on the hamlet areas themselves, because I think what we're also going to find is that's where a lot of, you know, some of your potential development might be able to take place, also in terms of some other initiatives that the town might want to consider. I think a lot of your hamlet areas will be a primary focus to some extent. So that's where, and a lot of this, again, is not specifically identified yet, because we need to go through public workshop 1 first, to then really hone in on what are the other topics that we're really going to focus on for workshop number 2.
So am I understanding it correctly that this we kind of solicited as part of the RFP process? This is what we heard the town board say, is that start general and then work your way down to the hamlets.
Yes.
It sounds like the goal is to have a draft vision statement and understand how the topic areas, strengths and weaknesses play into that vision statement, and then take it to the hamlets and get specific feedback from each hamlet on, do you agree with this? Yes or no? How do you customize this for your hamlet? Like, already have the broad framework in place and then drill down and make it applicable to each hamlet. Is that correct?
Exactly. And I think what you're going to find is, like, we're going to ask very similar questions in each hamlet, but the information that would be presented will be slightly different, because it's going to be focused on the hamlets areas. Mm-hmm. And when I say, and that's where I think not having the boundaries would be helpful, because the hamlet areas can be wider, right? And there might be an area that we wouldn't necessarily identify as like the core of that hamlet, but it might be something that we need to pay attention to. So that's, you know, by not having a very specific definition of a hamlet, and because the town is so large, we can have that kind of flexibility. And again, because we will find out when we go through the first public workshop, let's just say, we're going to definitely hit every one of the hamlet areas, but if there's another area within the community that really starts rising as an issue or a need that we need to take a look at, that's not technically a hamlet area, that might be something we might want to also have focus on. And that can also be included in a primary focus of the townwide discussion as well.
Mm-hmm. How does that sound to everybody? Do we have like a consensus that feels like a good direction to at least move towards? No, none of this is set in stone, but does that feel comfortable for everybody?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to have a great variety in the Hamlet discussions, because where you have Golden's Bridge, which has a very strong Hamlet feeling, whereas I live in the Lewisboro Hamlet, most people don't even know it exists.
Right.
Yeah, so we might need to combine or make that more, instead of having a Lewisboro specifically, maybe we make it more of a topic, but we'll kind of get a better sense of that as we go.
Right. And I think, and again, there's a lot of flexibility there, and we can work with, and let's just say after the initial first public meeting, this committee decides they want to do topic focused second workshops. We can still do that, right? And still talk about the hamlet areas, so there is that flexibility. And I think the first public workshop will really assist with us defining what's going to happen in the second workshop. But again, this community outreach plan is sort of like just the framework in which we're going to sort of operate. And, we also know COVID's coming around, potentially going to be an issue. So we might have to shift these to virtual, or we might have to shift or do some sort of combination. So this is something that we can also focus on and develop, and also revise in this particular outreach plan as to when we will make some of those decisions.
It's going to be very helpful when you give us the base map information and the trends and what your thoughts on where it's going and what's happening with the town in general. I think that would be very helpful. And also in this format, it will be helpful for those residents who choose to attend.
Right. So that last sentence, agree with all of that, but that last sentence, we need to talk about now the variation on format.
Yes.
Because if we have all of these meetings, either in person at a specified time or online at a specified time, that's the evenings or the weekends, then right there, we're excluding a bunch of people who perhaps can't get childcare or have jobs that are keeping them busy during those hours. Like, we need to make sure that we have a variety of formats, whether it be virtual, in person, focus groups, pop up, and pop up at an existing event, or pop up at a grocery store or a park on a Saturday. Like, we want to get as many voices as possible. And the only way we're going to do that is by varying the format, and making it as welcoming as possible, which is where the accessibility conversation comes in.
Right. So why don't we, so right now in this plan, we focused on having the hamlets as in-person meetings and identifying those as, we had some suggested locations, and this is based upon what I saw on maps. And then I think a couple committee members, provided a little bit of input on potential locations. We do recognize that we might have to shift to a virtual format, and that's fine. But right now we're looking to include this as, in person. If we want to try to develop a blend, that's fine too. We can also do something where we have a slightly, we would still have clearly people attend the meetings, but if we feel like, if this committee thinks that like some hamlets are probably not going to be as strong as, attendance as other hamlet areas, or if you feel that the hamlet areas might, let's just say, in some of our communities, a really good public participation is 100 people. But if you do that over 4 hours or 3 hours, when you have 20 people come in an hour, we can have a few staff attend that and then do something else with some of the other budget in terms of other community engagement. So it's really up to this committee on how you want to proceed. And the reason why we say it's up to you is because you know your community the best. And we've done it many different ways in other communities. And it really just depends on what you think would be most effective in terms of reaching out to those specific hamlet areas and the community at large.
So I want to hear people's thoughts, but I think the answer is, based on our previous conversation as committees, we don't really know the answer to those questions. We don't know who from which hamlets wants to be involved beyond who's already raised their hand, which is great, but is a limited amount of people. We don't know who the hard to reach groups are. I think if we are able to take some time and do like a participation and accessibility survey and poll the town, like, who wants to get involved? Do you want to be involved on a community outreach team and help put up flyers? Do you want to be involved and help staff some of these pop-up booths after Hamlet events? Do you have accessibility needs that would make it easier for you, more comfortable for you to attend a meeting, or make it even possible for you to attend a meeting? We kind of need to find out those answers. And the only way that I can think of is to do a townwide survey.
One suggestion I have is that you have, I don't know, what do we have, 17 town committees? And probably each of those committees has between 5 and 10 people. If we could kind of get the committees to be one of the paths to get people interested, I think you would have a really good resource there. So that's something that I want to just have people think about, is use the committees to spread the word, kind of, because the committees are made of people who are active, who are interested. And I think you could leverage that.
I agree. I just think we don't have committees that cover, we probably have some hard to reach areas that we don't necessarily know about that aren't covered by a committee. Like Charlie.
Well, I'm not saying it's the only method. I'm just
Right.
saying, look.
I think both are needed.
Yeah.
Both, all of the above. Agree.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like this committee thinks it's probably best if, like, maybe Katie speaks to the town board. Oh, I think Mark has his hand raised.
Yeah, let me just jump in. You probably covered this before, and sorry to be a broken record. The Board of Education, I understand.
Wait, time out. Sorry, Mark. Time out. Can we come back to that in a little bit? Because I think we got to keep rolling on this topic before we move on, because we only have 15 minutes left.
Okay. Hopefully we don't lose power.
Right.
Yeah, mine just flicked.
Yeah,
Yeah,
mine too.
mine's been flicking too. So
What were you
Can we
saying,
talk
Valerie?
about the survey? I think that's really important.
Yeah,
Katie?
Valerie, I think you were saying something about that. Please continue.
oh yes, so I think it sounds like that this committee wants to potentially petition the town board to do a survey, to be able to, first of all, identify who else is interested and how they would like to participate, right? So it could even be something like check boxes of, I want to, please send me the information, like, here's my email, or I want to be, help participate in the community outreach, right? So that's one thing. And then also in terms of, I think this committee is very concerned, and rightly so, about trying to be as accessible as possible to all potential populations that have needs. And so it's really trying to identify what those needs are and who that population is and how many people, right? Because then depending upon the number of people, we can give you options for the town's resources and how you want to handle that particular accessibility issue. And we've dealt with so many different communities, and every community has different issues and concerns and different populations and different needs. And we've been able to address them. It's just the difficulty is, and you saw in the draft plan, it doesn't have a lot of detail in it because we're looking for the town to identify which populations you want us to consider. And now I understand we want to do everybody, but what are really the needs within the community?
Yeah,
Valerie,
we just don't know because we have never really asked.
I'm not clear on who's going to do the survey and also who's going to have the questions. I mean, I'm sure you have the ability to put together a survey. You know what we need. You know, we know, or we can find out who to send it out to. But I would need some guidance, I'll speak for myself, as to what survey questions work in this instant to get that result.
Right. So I think, in terms of, do people want to participate? We've worked on those kind of surveys before. In terms of accessibility and what people's needs are, that's a little bit, I think, trickier, because if for some reason it's a language barrier, sending something out in English isn't necessarily going to get you the response you're looking for.
Yeah, exactly.
Or if some reason somebody's like, visually impaired, sending that out, so I think we're going to have to come up, or the town's going to have to come up with some different strategies in which to really figure out what those needs are.
Well, Katie has already talked to that disability committee. I think that's a way to get to people of that, in certain groups. But the general survey as to what people want, I think that you really have the information on that.
Yeah, we can partner with the advisory committee for the disabled. The chair is a huge source of knowledge for this type of survey. The committee had really helpful suggestions, so we can pull that resource. We can look at best practices, but we do need your team leading the way on this is what best practices in the industry are, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. There's definitely stuff out there.
And who's doing it? I mean, I don't.
Well, I think, and truthfully, in terms of accessibility surveys, JT, do you know of any?
I'm really not aware of anybody who has done that other than directly just talking with social service providers. I'm not really aware of any other efforts out there, and it's sort of a conundrum in that if you're worried about trying to access people that are hard to reach, and then you give them a survey, it's going to be hard to reach them with the survey. So I don't know that you're going to really get.
You gotta try.
I know you've got to try, but I would begin by using the social services networking professionals, those people that go out and work with folks that are hearing impaired or blind or have other disabilities, and or Meals on Wheels, and
there's a Meals on Wheels program in town. So
and that if you to find out where folks are and how many there are, I would bring in those leaders from those organizations.
Right. Another option is, you can, not to say that you can't do the survey, and we could provide you some survey questions. I think the issue is how best to get the information you're looking for.
Yeah.
Right. So, another option is, if you, like as JT said, if you know which organizations there are, maybe you provide them the survey questions in terms of what do they feel that their constituents, what would be best for their constituents. And then maybe use that as your baseline of developing your, accessibility techniques in your community outreach plan. And move forward with that, as opposed to having like a town-wide survey, and then maybe identifying if you want people to help participate in, like, because there's two different things. One's accessibility, and then one's like, do you want to participate in the comprehensive plan process? And so that could be something more of like, your web blasts or out to your town committees and just asking for general volunteers.
Yeah.
So that's a couple different, approaches to it. I mean, you could just do a survey, but I think in terms of those hard to reach populations, let's just say, I think we identified seniors, and I think we all agree with that. So let's reach out to the senior organizations and find out how it's best to get them engaged, right? Is it really, are they going to come to the workshops, or do we need to develop something to go to them?
Mm-hmm.
And in just as an example, in Chestnut Ridge, when we worked on the comprehensive plan, there's a very large facility run by a nonprofit organization that was a residential program for people that were disabled and people that were elderly, sort of like it wasn't exactly a nursing home. It was sort of a multi-level of care nonprofit run by a religious organization with several hundred residents. And we did not try to send a survey to the residents, but what we did do is we talked to the people that run the place and some of the social workers and got them on board, and they agreed to talk to the residents and help them fill out surveys where they would read them the questions and listen to the answers and fill it out for them and that type of thing.
We're definitely talking about that. We're also talking about language barriers, communities of people that don't necessarily speak English as their first language. But I see we're short on time, so we have to talk quickly, and then we'll come back to you, Charlene. How does this impact our timeline? Like, do we need to hit pause for a couple months and gather up this information and figure this all out and give you time to meet with all the committees and the boards? Like, I just feel like if we're going to try to hit a September deadline for the first meeting, this is going to get really tight really fast.
Right. So the original meeting schedules and stuff were based upon the 13-month time frame that this committee wanted to move forward with. I think if you recall, we even said that we thought that that's potentially going to be an aggressive schedule. And I think you see now why that is, because there's just a lot of decisions, right? And there's a lot of things to think about, and you want to do it right. So my suggestion would be maybe over the next month, we sort of figure out how we want to approach the accessibility. And I can work with Katie and we can work with the town board in terms of the accessibility and getting and identifying who else wants to help participate. Because I think what you're going to also realize is that all these events and all these outreach events you want to develop, besides the workshops and the committee meetings that we're going to undertake, some of it's going to be also participation from this committee, or finding other volunteers throughout the community that's going to want to help with all the outreach that's going to take place.
Mm-hmm.
So what we can do is I can potentially send around a draft agenda in terms of how we want to move through the public outreach process. And then we still have an agenda in terms of the existing conditions and working that information through to the committee. And those can work on sort of parallel tracks. They don't have to exactly move at the same lockstep, but you are going to want to have your public workshop first before you come out with any recommendations.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Charlene?
I think the survey for the accessibility, now that everybody's been talking about it, may not be our bailiwick. It may not be within our jurisdiction or our needs, because the survey is sort of like, what's accessible, what's not accessible, what we need is for those particular communities that are hard to reach to get involved in our process.
Right.
Rather than to have a survey of what's accessible and what's not. That's a town board thing. That's not really our thing. And in speaking about it, it's like, it doesn't seem like a survey for that particular area is really necessary for us. We just want to make sure that everybody's included in it and that everybody participates and everybody has a voice, not as to where particular things are accessible and not accessible.
I mean, I think the
What's on
community organization route, we don't even know if are there community groups that could put us in touch with folks in town that don't speak English as their first language?
We have to find out.
We got to find out, but maybe it's better to find out the organization and then drill down from the organization as opposed to try to send a survey to the individuals.
I mean, I think we have,
Absolutely.
we have some information as to how large those groups are from the census data.
Right. They're big enough that they need attention.
Right, if
Well,
you
I
can give us
think
a
he- I think
breakdown of
that-
it.
I think that even more important than the census is to talk to congregational leaders, school guidance counselors, folks that would interface with everybody in your community, regardless of income or language use. That because the census gives you numbers, but it doesn't tell you where these folks are that you want to reach and that you want to participate.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure that if you talk to pastors or guidance counselors at the school, you'd get a lot of ideas.
Right, and
Board
you know,
of Education.
the schools also, like, for example, like when I worked in the Austin School District, they had 34 different languages being spoken in those schools.
Right.
So then we had to figure out, okay, we're clearly not going to translate everything into 34. So then we had to figure out, like, where we're gonna, what are the big, specific languages.
Does that tie to your question about the Board of Education, Mark? Was it specifically about this? Okay, that's
Flyers and backpacks.
Yes.
When towns engage vote, register people to vote, they put a flyer in every kid's backpack in like 5 different languages. And so I'm just putting it out there that was one way to reach a big group.
Yes, I would say it works great for the elementary school kids. When you get to the middle school and high school kids, there's really high chance that they're not giving those flyers to the parents.
You know that from experience?
I know that from
Valerie?
experience, and also other communities where we did the backpack programs. Like they said, well, we can do the backpacks in the high school, but there's no guarantee. But elementary schools, we found very, very successful in that, for sure.
Okay.
Okay, so why don't we plan for next steps? Let's maybe Katie, you, I, maybe some of the town board liaisons kind of come up with maybe how to best approach this, and maybe some of the organizations we might want to reach out to, and in terms of some questions that we might want to ask those organizations to start identifying, because I think that's really the next piece, is identifying those, what we're calling the underrepresented groups or hard to reach groups, right? So if the town doesn't feel comfortable enough identifying them at this point, we need to figure out who they are and how best to identify them. And then we can talk about ways of engaging them.
Yeah, I'm sure they can give us some lists.
Yeah, they probably have resources, but they've made it clear that they don't have a good handle on what the extent that those groups exist and who they are. So they definitely need help identifying them too. Yeah, I mean, I will coordinate. Everybody keep an eye on your email, because we all have more thoughts and input, and there's just not enough time to get through everything. So please do follow up via email with thoughts, and we'll send out the action item list to kind of organize what we're doing. But please share any thoughts that you didn't get to share tonight via email.
Right. And then I think the next meeting, we could talk a little bit about, let's talk about schedules and timelines and play that out, because I also think a couple of things came up with the planning board, raised a couple questions. And I know we talked about it internally in our office too, is that you have a lot of community events taking place in the spring. And are those really important events that we want to have be present at? And if that's the case, how far along in the comprehensive plan process do you want to be? Or, do we want to look at in terms of community outreach and sort of engage and identify those as part of the outreach process, but where in the comprehensive plan process is that? Is that at the end of the process, which is technically that 13-month time frame would kind of put that at, or do we want to get them in the middle of the process? So, or at the beginning of the process, so we can talk about that as well.
Okay, but do we have are we all in agreement that we don't necessarily need to hit the 13-month timeline there's no reason to barrel forward just for the sake of barreling forward.
I don't think there's any reason to go for that if it's going to make it a weaker process. So
Mhm. Yeah, I see nodding heads.
I
So,
agree.
so take that, Valerie and team, please take that as, I mean, you can verify that with the town supervisor and the attorneys as necessary, but I think that we're giving you that. We would like that leeway to be extended if it's okay with the town board.
Sounds great. Okay,
We would recommend that. That's a good way of
Yeah.
putting it.
Yes,
Yes,
we recommend
yes.
that to the town board.
right.
Okay,
just curious, was our liaison invited tonight or did we keep that?
they have their own town board meeting tonight.
All right.
We tried to reschedule to accommodate them, but it just didn't. Okay.
Right, and did everybody hear that?
Were there any burning questions that didn't get answered? Okay,
All right, sounds good then. All right, so we'll regroup again. We have our next meeting in in August 17th. I think it's the August 17th. Is everyone able to?
August 15th.
15th, thank you,
August
sorry.
15th.
I'm
Will we
not
get
sure.
your materials before then?
So I think what's going to happen at the next meeting, I don't necessarily know if you're going to have a lot of materials in terms of the community outreach plan. I think we need to kind of follow up from
Like the
into
base
this
map stuff.
discussion to sort of, identify, right. But in terms of the maps and stuff, I think we're going to try to start on a little bit on the existing conditions and talk a little bit about some of the topic areas, just like one or two.
Yeah, I will not be available that week. So
I think we have to start checking with the liaisons ahead of time too, to make sure they're available. Because they won't be able to come to every meeting, but the more meetings, the better. Because we need the collaboration.
Okay, so why don't we, Katie, we'll put that on the to-do list too, to double check. And if we have to look at another date, we can.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you for your work in between meetings, everybody. It's much appreciated. And we definitely still have a long way to go before we're ready to sort of like we need to figure out how we're going to get community input and how we're going to get participation before we actually start getting it. So we still have a little ways to go.
Okay.
Okay. Adjourning meeting. Can I have a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you for watching. If you're still on YouTube, thanks for watching the whole time. We really appreciate it. And